This video is going to cover everything you need to know about Charge of the Light Brigade, a poem from the Power and Conflict anthology. Keep an eye out for key quotes to memorize, and be sure to take lots of notes. Let's start with some context so you know what it's about. The poem was written in 1854 by Alfred Lord Tennyson to commemorate the tragic cavalry charge at the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War, where Britain, France, and Turkey fought against Russia. This was a real event that took place, and it was kind of a colossal screw-up, as a miscommunication in orders sent a unit of British cavalry, called the Light Brigade, charging into a valley that was heavily defended by Russian artillery, armed with nothing but swords against enemy gunmen. As you might imagine, it ended pretty horrifically, with many of the soldiers killed or wounded, and the British public were understandably shocked about how something like this could happen, leading to debate about the competence of their military leadership and who was to blame for this tragic loss of life. Tennyson was poet laureate at the time, a position which meant that he was responsible for commemorating major events like these. Since it was a position that was given to him by the government, however, he was not keen to openly criticize them or the generals, and decided to put a spin on the tragedy by focusing instead on the bravery of the men who died, painting them as heroes rather than victims of a huge mistake. He did this through some very clever use of language and structure, and one of the most important tips I can give you when analyzing poetry is to pay attention to its structure. Many students forget to talk about this, but it is one of the easiest ways to get a better grade, as it often helps the author to get their message across. Remember, poetry is written to be read out loud, so how it is divided, how long the lines are, and where the author chooses to put full stops all affect the rhythm and pace of the poem. For instance, this poem is divided into 6 stanzas, each of which talks about a different stage of the conflict: the charge forward, the mindset of the soldiers, the clash with the enemy, the retreat, and finally the tribute to their sacrifice. The use of short, flowing lines with constant repetition paints a picture of the cavalry's relentless forward motion, and the opening line is a great example of this. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward has a rhythm which really does sound like horses' hooves galloping. This rhythm in poetry is called meter, and the specific meter that Tennyson uses puts stress on the first syllable, followed by 2 unstressed syllables. It's the same meter as patty cake baker's man, or dactylic dimeter if you're fancy. Poets use it to create motion and urgency in a flowing tone that sounds like galloping hooves, so it's no wonder that Tennyson chose it for his piece. It immediately sets the pace of the poem, and draws the reader into the unstoppable momentum and urgency that drove the soldiers forward, even though they knew they would die. However, you might notice that this momentum comes to a sudden halt at the end of each stanza, where the author places some of the only full stops in this poem. This matches the repeated reference to the 600 in the final line of each stanza, emphasizing the scale of the loss and the abrupt end to their lives. And speaking of repetition, the language that Tennyson uses is very purposeful, as it manages to turn a military disaster into an epic tale of heroism. One way he does this is to use biblical imagery of the Valley of Death, a phrase that is found in Psalm 23. The repetition of this phrase suggests that the soldiers' charge was righteous and moral, giving them an almost spiritual purpose, but also reminding the reader throughout the poem that the soldiers were headed to their doom. Repetition is the main literary device used here, as it matches the flowing rhythm of the poem, highlights the collective nature of their actions, and importantly, persuades the reader. You might notice that the repetition often happens in threes, and that is because it is actually a very powerful persuasive device that you will often hear great public speakers use. The rule of 3 is proven to make the speaker's point more memorable and impactful, which is why Tennyson relies on it a lot. Remember, he effectively needed to persuade the British public that the government didn't catastrophically mess up due to incompetence and send a unit of soldiers needlessly to their deaths. This, combined with the fast rhythm of the poem, sweeps up the reader into the action, ensuring that we don't get the chance to think too hard about what actually happened. For the same reason, Tennyson uses rhetorical questions that either don't need an answer or are answered for us, like, "When will their glory fade?" to kind of form our own opinion for us and tell us that their end was glorious rather than pointless. There is also heavy use of sound imagery in this poem, with phrases like volleyed and thundered, to mirror the booming of cannon fire and immerse the reader in the violence and horror of the battlefield. Interestingly, both the weaponry and death are personified, showing the link between them. The parallel lines, "cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them," creates a sense of claustrophobia and highlights that there is no escape from the jaws of death. This actually leads us into the first theme of this poem, which is duty and obedience. Just like Tennyson uses the rhythm and language to prevent his audience from thinking too much about the message of the poem, the soldiers weren't given a choice either about whether or not they wanted to ride out to war. This is captured in the repeated line, "Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die." This slight change of the common phrase "do or die" to "do and die" shows that the soldiers knew they were going to die, but did it anyway. In the military, absolute obedience to orders is expected, which is admirable but also tragic, as they had no choice but to follow their commands, even though they knew someone had blundered. Another theme linked closely to this is bravery and honor, as Tennyson emphasizes the soldiers' courage for riding without hesitation to almost certain death, with lines like "boldly they rode, and fought so well." He uses their sacrifice to elevate the soldiers to the status of heroes, ensuring that their brave death was more memorable than the incompetence that caused it. We are told at the end repeatedly to honor them, and it is interesting that that word is often linked with death, whether it is killing someone to restore a perceived loss of honor, or dying with honor. It can tend to be used as a way to justify death or make it meaningful. When the poem was first published, British readers were still reeling from the news, so for them, the poem was both a tribute and a comfort. So Tennyson fulfilled his duty at that time as poet laureate by shaping public memory of the event and avoiding criticism of the government. Even the one line, "someone had blundered," which is the only real instance of blame, was actually removed by Tennyson in the original publication, but restored in later versions. However, reading the poem now can look a little different in hindsight, especially after the perspective of World War I and II. The blind obedience of the soldiers may now seem more tragic than noble, and highlight the futility of war and its terrible cost of life. We can now view the poem as more than just a celebration of bravery, but also critique the authority and leadership behind it, as it wasn't the generals that made the mistake who rode to their deaths, but the soldiers, who are not remembered individually as people, human beings, but as one military unit, a brigade, or the 600. When we compare this poem to the others in the anthology, this is even more clear, as other poets like Wilfred Owen in Exposure and Ted Hughes in Bayonet Charge condemn the horror of battle and waste of life more openly, rather than whitewashing it as a patriotic sacrifice. What they all have in common, however, is that the soldiers themselves and their experiences should not be forgotten, and Tennyson certainly immortalized the Light Brigade in that way, depicting their tragic charge and the horror of the battlefield in an impactful, immersive way. If you want to see more videos on the Power and Conflict anthology, let me know which poems I should do next in the comments. See you next time!